Welcome to Staffworks Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about East Africa standard gauge railways, where we say that the next big move is connecting the networks. East Africa is entering a potentially decisive phase in its railway aspirations. The story is no longer simply about Kenya's building an SGR, Tanzania building another, or other East African countries pursuing their own railway projects. The big story is integration. Across the region, plans are advancing to connect this separate SGRs network into wider system linking the ports of Mombasa and Dar es Salaam with Uganda, Rwanda and Burundi, and potentially opening further routes into the Great Lakes region. That is the development worth watching. For years, East Africa has produced impressive railway maps, master plans, as well as political declarations. The missing ingredient has often been continuity, a railway that reaches one border while the next section remains unfunded, delayed, or stuck in negotiations. Now the pieces are beginning to move at the same time. Kenya is pushing its SGR westwards towards Uganda. Uganda is advancing its own Malaba-Kampala railways plans. Tanzania is expanding its central corridor network towards Mwanza as well as the Great Lakes, while pursuing connections with Rwanda and Burundi. If these projects are eventually completed and physically and operationally integrated, East Africa could have something much bigger than several national railways. It could have a regional railway system. Kenya Western Extension. Kenya already has operating Mombasa-Nairobi Suswa SGR. The strategic gap is extension from Naivasha through Kisumu to Malaba on the Ugandan border. Construction of the Kisumu-Malaba section was launched in 2026, advancing the Kenya's network towards Uganda. But the strategic importance goes beyond Kisumu or Malaba. If the Kenya line connects with Uganda planned SGR, Mombasa could gain a direct rail corridor into Kampala and eventually potentially to other countries in East Africa, including Rwanda, Burundi, and DRC. This changes the economic proposition. The Mombasa SGR would no longer be primarily a Kenya railway. It would become part of the regional corridor. Uganda is the critical link here. Uganda occupies a particularly important position in this network. As a landlocked country, Uganda needs efficient, competitive access to the sea. Its planned Malaba-Kampala SGR will provide the missing continuation of the Kenyan railway into Ugandan capital. Uganda has already made progress towards financing its section, including support from the Islamic Development Bank. But the bigger prize is connectivity. Once the train theoretically travel from Mombasa through Nairobi to Naivasha, across the Kenyan-Ugandan border and into Kampala, the Northern Corridor becomes a fundamentally different proposition. And that is precisely why integration matters more than individually national projects. Tanzania is building the other half of the regional equation. At the same time, Tanzania is developing its own SGR network from Dar es Salaam westwards. The central corridor is being extended towards Tabora, Isaka, Mwanza, while Tanzania is also pursuing a railway connection from Vinza to Musongati in Burundi. The project is valued more than $2 billion. Tanzania and Rwanda are also pursuing plans for an SGR extension from Isaka to Kigali, extending the central corridor into Rwanda. This is where the regional picture becomes particularly interesting. Kenya is pushing west from Mombasa. Tanzania is pushing west from Dar es Salaam. Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi sit between and beyond these networks. The long-term objective is therefore not simply to build two competing railways. It is to create interconnected corridors serving the same regional market. But Kenya and Tanzania do not have identical systems. This is important technical issue that tends to disappear beneath the political rhetoric about regional integration. Kenya's existing SGR is diesel electric, while Tanzania's new SGR is being developed as an electrified railway using overhead electric traction. That difference matters. You cannot simply assume that because two railways use SGR or standard gauge, trains can automatically run seamlessly from one system into another. The gauge only is the only one part of interoperability. Power systems, signaling, train control technology, safety standards, loading limits, operating procedures, and lowering stocks all matter. In fact, the Kenya-Tanzania situation illustrates why integration should be treated as a process rather than one engineering event. In the short term, there can be interchange, which can still work. The region does not necessarily have to wait for every railway to become technically identical. In the short term, integration could operate through planned interchange points. A Kenyan train could carry passengers or freight to an agreed point or border point for that matter. Cargo and passengers could be transferred efficiently to a compatible Tanzania train and continue to the final destination. This is not as seamless as a train running from Mombasa to Kigali without changing locomotives or rolling stock, but it is still regional integration, provided the transfer is fast, predictable, and commercially coordinated. The real enemy is not changing trains. The real enemy is delay. If a container can be transferred between systems in an organized terminal within a predictable period, the economic penalty may be manageable. If it sits at a border for 2 days because agencies, railway operators, custom systems are not coordinated, the entire logic of rail competitiveness begins to collapse. In the long term, Kenya faces an electrification question. The longer term issue is more complicated. As Kenya expands its railway aspirations, the question of electrification becomes increasingly relevant. If Kenya eventually electrifies its SGR network, the technical gap between the Kenyan and Tanzania systems could potentially become easier to manage, depending on the final traction, signaling, and interoperability standards which are adopted. But electrification is not simply a matter of installing overhead wires. It requires substantial capital, power infrastructure, substations, signaling integration, lowering stock decisions, as well as long-term operational planning. Kenya therefore has a strategic decision ahead. Does it continue expanding as a diesel electric SGR system, or does it progressively move towards an electrified network capable of deeper interoperability with the Tanzania Railway? That question should be addressed as part of a regional and long-term railway architecture, rather than after billions have already been invested in compatible systems. Integration is bigger than tracks. A genuinely integrated SGR network would require compatible technical standards, signaling safety systems, lowering stocks arrangements, and as well as operating procedures. It would also require cooperation on customs, border controls, tariffs, transit documentation, as well as cargo handling. Imagine a container leaving the port in Kenya. The objective should be eventually for that cargo to travel through the rail through Kenya, cross into Uganda, and continue towards its final destination without unnecessary transfer, bureaucratic delays, as well as incompatible railway procedures. The same principle could apply to cargo leaving Dar es Salaam for Rwanda or Burundi. That is the real promise of regional railway integration. One network does not necessarily mean one railway company. It means different national systems working together as one corridor. Competition is real, and that is not necessarily bad. There is inevitably a strategic contest between the northern corridor through Mombasa and the central corridor through Dar es Salaam, but both want to serve Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the wider Great Lakes region. That competition could be beneficial. Ports and railway operators will have an incentive to improve efficiency, reduce transit times, as well as offer competitive prices. But East Africa should not end up building duplicate infrastructure simply because every country wants to own its own route for every market. The objective should be complementarity and choice, not wasteful duplication. A trader in Kampala should be able to select the most efficient route. A Rwandan importer should be able to compare Mombasa and Dar es Salaam. Burundian exporters should not have to depend on one corridor. That is what genuine integration can deliver. Financing remains the elephant in the room. These railways cost billions of dollars. Kenya's western extension, Uganda, Malaba, Kampala Railway, Tanzania Central Corridor Extension, the Rwandan connection, as well as the Burundi Railway, all require enormous capital. That creates a difficult question. Will there be enough cargo to justify the investment? A railway can be economically valuable without being financially profitable. It may reduce congestion, stimulate trade, and create regional economic benefits while still requiring government support. These two concepts, economic viability and commercial viability, must not be confused. Traffic forecasts, therefore, need to be rigorous. How much freight will actually move by rail? How quickly will the volumes grow? How much will shippers pay? How will road transport compete? What happens if economic growth is slower than expected? These are the questions that financiers and taxpayers will eventually ask. Integration is the real project. The most important thing to watch, therefore, not simply the number of kilometers each country constructs. It is whether the countries are preparing the interface between their railways. Will Kenya and Uganda operate the border crossing as one efficient logistics process? Will Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi achieve similar integration? Will customs systems be connected? Will operators coordinate schedules? Will lowering stocks and technical standards be compatible where required? And where they are not, will efficient interchange facilities prevent passengers and cargo from being trapped at borders? If the answer is yes, East Africa could create a railway network capable of changing the economics of regional trade. If the answer is no, the region could end up with several expensive modern railways that happen to stop at national borders. The opportunity is enormous, but so is responsibility. The emerging plans to connect Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, SGRs systems could be one of the region's most consequential infrastructure development. Mombasa and Dar es Salaam could become competing gateways into one increasingly interconnected market. Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi could gain greater choice in accessing international trade routes. Freight could shift from road to rail. Transport costs could fall. Transit times could improve, as well as manufacturers could gain access to a much larger regional market. But the real achievement will not be inauguration of another railway section. It will be the day when East Africa's separate railway system can function as one coordinated logistics networks, even if some technical differences require interchange in the short term. The tracks are only the beginning. The real test is whether East Africa can make them work together. If Kenya and Tanzania align their railway strategies, if Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi can connect into those systems, and if the governments solve the technical, financial, as well as border management problems standing between them, the region could finally turn decades of railway plans into genuine integrated trade networks. That is the opportunity, but it will require more than concrete and steel as well as locomotive. It will require interoperability, financing, coordination, political commitment that survives beyond individual administrations. Because ultimately the winner of the SGRs should not simply be Mombasa or Dar es Salaam. It should be East Africa. So thank you for coming this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can watch other videos that we have made on SGRs in Africa and East Africa in general. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.